So here's something they definitely glossed over in your school mythology unit. Greek mythology is spectacularly, unapologetically, beautifully gay. Not subtle about it either. We're talking explicit poetry, detailed artwork on expensive vases, stories told at symposiums where educated men would nod appreciatively at the romantic bits. The ancient Greeks didn't whisper about same-sex love or hide it in footnotes. They celebrated it in their greatest epics, carved it into temple friezes, and wove it into the very fabric of their most sacred myths. Tonight, we're going on a rather long journey together. Not just one story, but the complete collection of same-sex love stories from Greek mythology, told exactly as the ancient poets intended. From the king of the gods falling hopelessly for a shepherd boy, to tragic romances that created flowers, to the greatest warriors whose love defined entire wars. We're covering it all in one comprehensive exploration, because these stories deserve to be heard together, as a complete tapestry of how one of history's most influential civilizations understood love, desire, and devotion between men. This is going to take a while. Settle in, dim the lights, and prepare for 2 hours of stories that span from Mount Olympus to the battlefields of Troy, from the depths of the underworld to sun-drenched Greek islands. We're reading the myths the way Homer, Ovid, Plato, and Pindar actually wrote them, before anyone decided certain types of love needed editing out of history. And if you're wondering whether these interpretations are legitimate, whether modern scholars are perhaps reading too much into ancient friendships, the ancient Greeks themselves left no room for doubt. They were remarkably clear about who loved whom. It's only later translators who suddenly developed selective reading comprehension. Chapter 1. Zeus and Ganymede, when the king of gods falls for a shepherd. Picture Mount Ida in the land the Greeks called Phrygia, sometime in the misty age when gods walked openly among mortals and divine intervention was less miracle and more occupational hazard. The mountain slopes were covered in olive groves and grazing land, scattered with white sheep that looked like clouds fallen to earth. The air smelled of wild thyme and sun-warmed stone, and tending those sheep, completely unaware that his life was about to change in the most dramatic way possible, was a young man named Ganymede. Now, the ancient poets dedicated considerable ink to describing Ganymede's appearance, which should tell you something right there. This wasn't a casual mention of a character. Homer called him the loveliest of mortals. Ovid spent actual verses on his beauty. The poet Theognis wrote that Ganymede's beauty was such that it kindled desire in Zeus himself, when ancient Greek poets, who are not generally prone to understatement, all agree someone was spectacularly beautiful. You can assume they meant it. Ganymede was a prince, actually, son of King Tros of Troy, though on this particular day he was doing the entirely ordinary work of watching his father's sheep. Imagine him there on the mountainside, probably in his late teens, dark curly hair, skin bronzed by endless days in the Mediterranean sun, completely absorbed in the simple task of keeping sheep from wandering off cliffs or into ravines. Perhaps he was playing a shepherd's flute, or simply lying in the grass watching clouds drift across an impossibly blue sky. And then Zeus saw him. Zeus, who had literally everything, power over sky and storm, ruler of Olympus, immortal, all-powerful, could have anything he desired with a snap of his divine fingers. But there's something about genuine beauty, about grace and youth and that particular quality of unself-conscious loveliness that transcends even divine satisfaction. Zeus looked down from Olympus, saw this shepherd prince on his mountainside, and experienced what the ancient Greeks called eros, not just attraction, but that overwhelming, breath-stealing, world-tilting desire that makes you do spectacularly impulsive things. The king of the gods decided he needed to have Ganymede on Olympus, immediately, forever. Now, Zeus had options for approaching this situation. He could have appeared in divine glory, made his case, perhaps negotiated with the boy's father like a reasonable immortal being. But Zeus, as we know from virtually every other myth about him, was not really one for measured approaches. Instead, he transformed himself into an eagle, the king of birds for the king of gods, naturally, and simply abducted Ganymede from the mountainside. Picture the scene. One moment you're a teenage prince watching sheep, maybe thinking about what's for dinner, and the next moment an enormous golden eagle with eyes that somehow seem knowing, almost human, descends from the sky. Talons, thankfully gentle because divine eagles apparently have excellent control, grasp you by the shoulders, and suddenly you're airborne. The sheep are getting smaller below you. The mountain is dropping away. The whole of Phrygia spreads out like a map, and you're still rising, up through the clouds, higher than any mortal has ever travelled. And the eagle's grip is firm but somehow protective, and those eyes, when you catch their gaze, hold something that isn't quite animal. The ancient vase paintings of this scene are something else. We have hundreds of them, red figure pottery, black figure pottery, elaborate craters and amphorae that were expensive commissioned pieces. They show the moment of abduction in loving detail. Zeus as an eagle, Ganymede in the bird's grasp, and the expressions on Ganymede's face range from startled to curious to, in some cases, rather pleased about the whole thing. The Greeks put this scene on their finest pottery. That's not the imagery you choose for something shameful. That's the imagery you choose for romance. So Ganymede arrives on Olympus, carried by Zeus, who presumably transforms back into his divine form at some point, though the myths are discreetly vague about the exact logistics. What they're not vague about is what happens next. Zeus makes Ganymede his cupbearer. Now, cupbearer in this context is doing a lot of work as a euphemism, except it isn't actually a euphemism, because the ancient Greeks didn't need euphemisms for this. Ganymede literally did serve as cupbearer. He poured nectar for the gods at divine feasts. But he was also Zeus's eromenos, his beloved, his companion, his lover. The Greeks had specific words for these relationships, particularly the formalized relationship between an older man and a younger one. They wrote about them openly. Plato discussed them in philosophical dialogues. This wasn't scandalous. This was just how things were. Zeus, hopelessly besotted with his beautiful shepherd prince, made Ganymede immortal, gave him eternal youth so that beauty would never fade, installed him as a permanent fixture on Olympus, pouring nectar at divine feasts and, according to pretty much every ancient source, sharing Zeus's bed. The king of gods was, by all accounts, completely devoted to Ganymede. We're talking gifts, attention, the kind of doting favoritism that made the other gods exchange knowing glances. And then there was Hera. Hera, Zeus's wife, queen of the gods, who had long since developed a rather justified irritation with her husband's wandering affections, was not pleased. She dealt with Zeus's mortal mistresses, Io, Europa, Semele, Danae, and dozens of others. Each one was an insult, but at least they were mortal. They aged. They died. The problem eventually resolved itself. But Ganymede was immortal now. Ganymede was permanent. Ganymede was going to be sitting at divine feasts, beautiful and young and pouring nectar, forever. The ancient sources give us various versions of Hera's reaction, ranging from cold fury to active attempts at making Ganymede's immortal life difficult. Some versions say she tried to have him thrown from Olympus. Others say she simply made her displeasure known in that particular way that queen goddesses have of making their feelings perfectly clear without saying a single word. Zeus, caught between his beloved and his wife, did what many people caught in awkward romantic situations do, absolutely nothing, and hoped it would sort itself out. It didn't, obviously, but Ganymede remained on Olympus. You can see him in the art standing behind Zeus at feasts, beautiful and young, pouring nectar from an elaborate golden jug. The cup-bearer of the gods became one of the most popular subjects in Greek art. We find him on vases in mosaics carved in relief on temple walls. The image of Zeus as an eagle carrying Ganymede was so prevalent it became a standard decorative motif. This was mainstream culture, not underground art. But the story doesn't end with just an immortal romance, because Zeus loved Ganymede so much that he wanted everyone to remember him forever. So he placed Ganymede in the stars as the constellation Aquarius, literally the water-bearer or cup-bearer, where he pours celestial water across the night sky for eternity. And the eagle that carried him? That's Aquila, flying right beside him through the heavens. Even the cosmos itself preserves this love story. Think about that for a moment. Zeus could have chosen anything to immortalize in the constellations. He chose his beloved Ganymede. When ancient Greeks looked up at the night sky and traced the stars of Aquarius, they saw the most beautiful mortal boy who caught the attention of the king of gods. That's not a footnote. That's not historical roommates. That's a love story written in stars. Later Roman poets like Ovid and Virgil retold this story, and they didn't soften it. They called Ganymede the Phrygian boy who stirred desire in Jove, Jove being the Roman name for Zeus. They described Zeus's passion openly. Virgil in the Aeneid mentions Ganymede as the one Jupiter took for his own pleasure. This was classical literature, studied by every educated Roman, required reading for the elite. The story of Zeus and Ganymede became so culturally embedded that Ganymede became a word in its own right. Renaissance Europeans used it to mean a young male beloved, a beautiful youth, a boy in that kind of relationship. The story was painted during the Renaissance by masters like Rubens and Rembrandt. Michelangelo drew it. This myth endured for thousands of years, always with its romantic core intact. Now, it's worth noting that by modern standards, there are some uncomfortable elements here. The age difference, the power imbalance, the whole abduction situation, none of this would fly today, nor should it. The ancient Greeks had very different cultural norms around these relationships, particularly the institution of pederasty, which was formalized and socially acceptable in their culture, but which we rightly view critically today. But setting aside modern ethical concerns and looking purely at how the ancient Greeks understood and portrayed this story, they saw it as romantic, passionate, and worthy of celebration. Ganymede wasn't portrayed as a victim. He was portrayed as beloved, honored, made immortal, placed among the stars. The myth tells us something important about how the Greeks understood love and desire. Zeus, the most powerful being in their pantheon, falls for a beautiful mortal man and makes that man immortal to keep him forever. That's not a cautionary tale. That's not a shameful secret. That's an epic romance granted with a rather dramatic beginning, but a romance nonetheless that the Greeks told and retold for centuries. And Zeus's attraction to Ganymede wasn't portrayed as somehow separate from or less than his attractions to women. The Greeks didn't see sexuality as a binary choice. Zeus loved women. Zeus loved Ganymede. Both things were true, neither contradicted the other, and the ancient Greeks saw no need to pick one as the real Zeus and explain away the other. He was simply Zeus, whose passions ranged wide, whose desires encompassed beauty in all its forms. Before we move on to other gods and other love stories, it's worth mentioning that Zeus and Ganymede weren't the only male-male relationship on Olympus involving Zeus. Various ancient sources mention other young men who caught Zeus's eye, though none with the prominence of Ganymede. But Ganymede remained the favourite, the one who lasted, the one immortalized in both divine court and starry sky. The ancient playwright Euripides wrote a play, now lost except for fragments, about Ganymede. The philosopher Plato referenced the story in his Symposium as an example of love between men. The poet Pindar wrote odes mentioning Ganymede's beauty. This wasn't obscure mythology. This was mainstream culture, taught to students, discussed by philosophers, celebrated in art. So, when modern retellings of Greek mythology somehow manage to tell you all about Zeus's countless mortal mistresses, but forget to mention Ganymede, or mention him only as a cupbearer without context, or suggest he was like a son to Zeus, which no, absolutely not. The ancient sources are completely clear about this. That's not scholarly accuracy. That's selective editing. That's someone deciding which parts of mythology are acceptable to teach. But tonight, we're not editing. Tonight, we're reading the myths as written, and according to every ancient Greek source we have, the king of gods loved a shepherd boy so much he made him immortal and put him in the stars. That's the story the Greeks told. That's the story we're telling tonight. And this is just the beginning. Because Zeus might be king of gods, but he wasn't the only one on Olympus with a romantic history that included male lovers. In fact, Pretty much every major Greek god has at least one same-sex love story. Some tragic, some triumphant, all of them completely explicit in ancient sources and somehow mysteriously absent from modern mythology textbooks. So let's continue our journey through divine love affairs, from Olympus to the sun-drenched shores of Greece, from the king of gods to the god of light, music, and tragically, tragic love stories. Next, we meet Apollo, who was beautiful, talented, beloved by all, and whose greatest love story ended with flowers and eternal grief. Chapter 2. Apollo's Tragic Romances. If Zeus was the king of gods with wandering affections, Apollo was the golden prince whose loves ended in heartbreak. Beautiful, talented, basically perfect in every conceivable way, and absolutely cursed when it came to romance. The ancient Greeks gave Apollo everything. He was god of music, poetry, prophecy, healing, the sun itself in later traditions. They made him the embodiment of classical male beauty, the ideal youth. And then they gave him the most devastating love stories in all of mythology. Apollo loved both women and men, and with roughly equal tragic results across the board. But his male lovers, particularly Hyacinthus and Cyparissus, became some of the most famous romantic tragedies in classical literature, stories so heartbreaking that Romans wept over them centuries later, stories that Renaissance poets retold with genuine emotion, stories that somehow modern mythology books often reduce to a single sentence if they mention them at all. Picture ancient Sparta, though not the militaristic warrior society of later reputation. This is earlier mythological Sparta, when it was still a kingdom ruled by King Amyclas. The palace sits in the fertile valley of the Eurotas River, surrounded by mountains that turn purple at sunset. The air smells of olive groves and wild herbs, and the gymnasium, that peculiarly Greek institution where young men trained in athletics completely nude because the Greeks had very specific ideas about physical culture, rings with the sounds of athletic competition. And in that gymnasium, training with the focused intensity that Spartan princes were known for, was Hyacinthus. The ancient poets, much like with Ganymede, dedicated considerable effort to describing Hyacinthus's appearance. Ovid called him the loveliest of youths. The poet Lucian described him as having beauty that surpassed all other mortals. He was a Spartan prince, son of King Amyclas, which meant he'd been training in athletics since childhood. Picture him, probably late teens, the kind of athletic build you get from actual training rather than a gymnasium, dark curly hair traditional to Greek depictions, and that particular grace that comes from someone completely comfortable in their own body. He was good at discus throwing, javelin, wrestling, all the traditional athletic competitions that Greek men valued. And Apollo, god of basically everything culture and civilization held dear, saw him and fell completely, hopelessly in love. Now, Apollo didn't do anything by halves. When he fell hard. The myths tell us he abandoned Olympus, literally left his divine duties, to spend time in Sparta with Hyacinthus. The god of prophecy, who could see the future, chose to live in the mortal world because that's where his beloved was. Apollo, who could have commanded attention with divine glory, instead came to Sparta as himself, without artifice or divine theatrics, because what he wanted was genuine connection. The ancient sources describe them spending their days together in pursuits both athletic and intellectual. This wasn't just physical attraction, though there was certainly that. This was companionship. They'd spend mornings in the gymnasium, Apollo training alongside Hyacinthus in discus throwing and other sports. Afternoons might find them hunting in the mountains, because Sparta was surrounded by wild country perfect for the chase. The poet Ovid, in his Metamorphoses, describes their relationship with language that leaves absolutely no ambiguity about its nature. He writes of Apollo's passion, his devotion, how the god found no greater pleasure than being always in the company of his beloved. This is the same Ovid who wrote some of the most celebrated love poetry in Latin literature. He knew how to describe romantic love, and that's exactly what he was describing. There was another suitor, though. Zephyrus, the west wind, also loved Hyacinthus. The myths tell us Zephyrus had pursued the Spartan prince but Hyacinthus had chosen Apollo. And Zephyrus apparently did not handle rejection well. The wind god watched, jealous and bitter, as Apollo and Hyacinthus spent their days together in obvious happiness. One particular afternoon, and this is where the tragedy arrives because Greek myths are fundamentally tragedies, even when they start with joy, Apollo and Hyacinthus were in the gymnasium training with the discus. It was hot, the kind of Mediterranean summer heat that makes the air shimmer. They'd been throwing for hours, that easy companionship of two people comfortable enough to compete without ego getting involved. Apollo went first. Being a god, his throw was impressive. The discus flew high and far, arcing against the blue sky. Hyacinthus, laughing, eager to match his lover's achievement, ran after it. He wanted to catch it, or perhaps just to mark where it landed so he could try to beat the distance. Young, athletic, competitive in that way Spartan princes were trained to be. And Zephyrus, watching from the winds, saw his opportunity. The myths tell us the west wind intervened, blowing the discus off its trajectory. It struck Hyacinthus in the head. Apollo ran to him, a god who could move faster than mortal sight and still not fast enough. Hyacinthus fell, blood streaming from the wound, and Apollo caught him as he collapsed. The god of healing, who could cure any mortal ailment, who had the power of life and death in his divine hands, held the boy he loved and found himself helpless. Because there are rules even for gods. Death, once arrived, cannot be reversed by Olympic deities. Even Apollo, golden Apollo who had everything, couldn't save him. Ovid's description of this scene is genuinely heartbreaking. Apollo tries everything, presses his hands to the wound to stop the bleeding, speaks healing incantations, offers nectar to revive him. Nothing works. Hyacinthus dies in Apollo's arms, and the god who had never known real powerlessness suddenly understands what it means to be helpless. The ancient texts describe Apollo's grief in detail. He tears at his golden hair, he holds Hyacinthus's body and weeps. He cries out that he would trade places if he could, would give up his immortality to bring Hyacinthus back. And he blames himself because it was his discus, his throw, his idea to train that afternoon. "If only I could follow you in death," Ovid has Apollo say, "but since fate denies me this, you shall be with me forever in memory and song." And then Apollo did what gods do when mortal death takes someone they love. He transformed grief into immortality of a different kind. Where Hyacinthus's blood fell on the ground, Apollo caused a flower to grow. The hyacinth, with its deep purple petals that the Greeks thought looked like they bore the letters AI, AI, the Greek exclamation of grief, of mourning. Every spring, when hyacinths bloomed across Greece, people would remember this story, the beauty of the flower, the tragedy of the love that created it. But Apollo did more than create a flower. He established a festival in Sparta, the Hyacinthia, one of the most important religious festivals in the Spartan calendar. It lasted 3 days. The first day was for mourning Hyacinthus's death. Solemn, sorrowful, ritualized grief. The following days celebrated his memory with music, athletic competitions, feasting. It was one of the few times austere Sparta indulged in real festivity. This festival continued for centuries. We have historical records of it from the classical period, long after the mythological age supposedly ended. The Spartans honored Hyacinthus annually, and the nature of his relationship with Apollo was never in question. They knew it was a love story. That's why they mourned him. The myth was retold constantly in ancient literature. Ovid gave it extensive coverage in the Metamorphoses. Lucian wrote about it. Pausanias, the ancient travel writer, described seeing Hyacinthus's shrine in Sparta and explained the full story. The poet Philostratus wrote an entire ekphrasis, a detailed literary description of a painting depicting Apollo and Hyacinthus together, describing their obvious mutual affection. Later, Renaissance and neoclassical artists painted this scene repeatedly. Apollo mourning over Hyacinthus's body became a standard subject for artists exploring classical themes. Some of these paintings are remarkably sensual. Beautiful male bodies, evident grief, the intimacy of the embrace as Apollo holds his dying lover. These weren't hidden away. They hung in museums and palaces. The tragedy of Apollo and Hyacinthus resonated through centuries because it's fundamentally a story about love and loss that anyone can understand. The person you love dies suddenly, senselessly, and you'd give anything, even immortality, to bring them back. That's universal human experience, and the Greeks understood that whether the lovers were man and woman, man and a man, or god and a mortal didn't change the fundamental emotional truth. But Hyacinthus wasn't Apollo's only tragic male love story. There was also Cyparissus, and if anything, this one is even sadder. Cyparissus was a youth from the island of Chios, described by Ovid as exceptionally beautiful and dear to Apollo. The god loved him, visited him often, spent time with him. But this story isn't about their relationship directly. It's about what grief does to love. Cyparissus had a pet stag. Not a dog, not a horse, but a magnificent sacred stag with golden antlers, completely tame, who followed him everywhere. The boy loved this creature more than anything. He'd weave flower garlands for its antlers, ride on its back through meadows, sleep beside it. It was companion, pet, perhaps the kind of pure, innocent love that young people feel for animals before the world gets complicated. One summer afternoon, Cyparissus was out hunting, not for his stag, but for other game. The stag was resting in the shade, hidden in tall grass. Cyparissus threw his javelin at what he thought was appropriate prey. The javelin struck true, and when he ran to claim his kill, he found his beloved stag dying, the javelin through its heart. The boy was devastated, absolutely destroyed by grief and guilt. He wept over the stag's body, blamed himself. And when Apollo came to him, Apollo, who understood grief intimately after Hyacinthus, and tried to comfort him, tried to tell him it was an accident, that he shouldn't torture himself, Cyparissus couldn't be consoled. He begged the gods to let him mourn forever, to never stop grieving. And the gods, in that way they have of granting wishes literally, obliged. Cyparissus began to transform. His legs rooted to the earth. His arms became branches. His body became a trunk. His hair became dark green foliage. He turned into a cypress tree, the tree that would forever after be associated with mourning and death in Greek culture. Apollo could only watch as the boy he loved turned to wood. He touched the trunk, still warm, still alive in a sense, but no longer human, no longer able to speak or laugh or return affection. And Apollo declared that the cypress would be associated with mourning forever, that these trees would stand at graves and temples as eternal remembrance of grief. Ovid tells this story in his Metamorphoses with genuine pathos. It's shorter than the Hyacinthus tale, but no less emotionally resonant. Apollo loves someone, tries to help them through grief, and loses them anyway. Not to death exactly, but to something equally final. The transformation into a tree is permanent. Cyparissus exists, but not in any way that allows relationship or communication. It's worth noting the pattern here. Apollo, golden god of civilization and culture, repeatedly falls in love with beautiful mortal youths and loses them to tragedy. The Greeks didn't see this as punishment exactly, but there's definitely a sense that immortal love for mortals is inherently doomed. The god continues forever. The beloved mortals die or transform or are lost. Apollo experiences grief repeatedly and continues existing through it, which might be its own kind of tragedy. These stories, Apollo and Hyacinthus, Apollo and Cyparissus, were foundational to Greek literature and culture. They were taught, retold, referenced constantly. When the Romans adopted Greek culture wholesale, they adopted these stories too, retaining every romantic detail. The philosopher Plato references Apollo's male lovers in the Symposium, his dialogue about the nature of love. The poet Theocritus mentions them. They appear in plays, poems, historical accounts of religious festivals. This wasn't hidden knowledge. This was mainstream culture. And notably, these stories were held up as examples of genuine, deep love. The Greeks didn't categorize love the way modern culture often does. They had different words for different types of love: eros for passionate desire, philia for affectionate friendship, agape for charitable love, storge for familial love. Apollo's love for Hyacinthus was described as eros, passionate, romantic, all-consuming. The same word they used for the love between Paris and Helen, between Odysseus and Penelope. When later scholars and translators started rendering these myths into English and other modern European languages, something interesting happened. Suddenly, Apollo and Hyacinthus were dear friends. The flowers grew from the blood of Apollo's beloved companion. The grief was for a student or favorite. The language got very careful, very euphemistic. But the ancient Greeks weren't euphemistic. They were explicit. The relationship was romantic, physical, and tragic. That's the story they told for over 1,000 years. It's also worth noting that these tragic love stories served a cultural function beyond just entertainment. The Greeks used mythology to explore human experiences and emotions. These stories about Apollo, god who has everything except the power to prevent death, grappling with loss and grief, gave the Greeks a framework for understanding their own experiences. When someone lost a loved one, they had these stories that said, even the gods understand this pain. Even Apollo, golden and perfect, knows what it means to hold someone you love as they die. The festivals and rituals associated with these myths, particularly the Hyacinthia, gave communities structured ways to process grief and celebrate memory. The flowers and trees created from these tragedies meant that every spring bloom, every cypress in a cemetery, carried echoes of these stories. Mythology became embedded in the natural world, and through all of it, the romantic nature of these relationships was never questioned in ancient sources. That's a modern invention, the uncertainty about whether these were really romantic or just very intense friendships. The Greeks didn't have that ambiguity. They knew what they meant, and they said what they meant. Apollo's male lovers were part of his mythology just as much as his female loves like Daphne or Cassandra. All of them tragic in various ways, because Apollo's love stories were generally disasters, but all of them told and retold as genuine romance. Before we move on to other gods, it's worth mentioning that Apollo had other male lovers referenced in various myths, Admetus, Brancus, Antimonius among them. Some stories are fragments, others more complete, but they all confirm the same pattern. Apollo loved men as well as women, and ancient Greek culture saw nothing unusual about this. So when modern retellings of Greek mythology give you detailed accounts of Apollo's pursuit of Daphne, but somehow forget to mention Hyacinthus, or they mention him only as a tragic accident, without the romantic context, you're not getting the full story. You're getting an edited version, scrubbed clean of content someone decided was inappropriate. But tonight, we're telling the complete story. And according to every ancient source we have, Apollo loved Hyacinthus so deeply that he created an eternal flower from his grief. Next, we travel from the golden halls of Apollo's temple to the depths of the ocean, where Poseidon, god of the sea, had his own complicated romantic history with beautiful mortal men. Chapter 3. Poseidon's Passions. From the sun-drenched heights of Apollo's realm, we descend now to the depths of the sea, where Poseidon ruled over a kingdom as vast and tempestuous as his own nature. If Zeus was the king of gods, and Apollo the golden prince of culture, Poseidon was something more primal, lord of earthquakes and ocean storms, horses and sea monsters, capable of both devastating rage and surprising tenderness. The Greeks feared him and honoured him in equal measure, building temples along every coastline, offering sacrifices before every voyage. And like his brothers, Poseidon's romantic history included both women and men, though his male lovers often get conveniently forgotten in modern retellings. Which is unfortunate because some of the most significant mythological stories involve Poseidon's passion for mortal men, particularly Pelops, whose story connects to one of the most famous dynasties in Greek mythology, and Nereids, whose tale explains the origins of the sea snail. These weren't minor myths. These were stories that ancient Greeks knew intimately, referenced constantly, and understood as foundational to their mythological tradition. So let's dive into the wine-dark sea and discover what the god of earthquakes and horses did when he fell in love. The story of Pelops begins in Anatolia, in the wealthy kingdom of Lydia ruled by King Tantalus. Now, Tantalus himself is famous in mythology for his eternal punishment in Tartarus, standing in water that recedes when he tries to drink, beneath fruit trees whose branches pull away when he reaches for them, hence our word tantalize. But before his spectacular fall from divine favour, Tantalus was rich, powerful, and father to a son named Pelops, who was, according to every ancient source, extraordinarily beautiful. Pindar, one of the greatest Greek poets, devoted considerable attention to Pelops in his first Olympian ode. This wasn't some obscure text. Pindar's victory odes were performed at the Olympic Games, memorized, studied, considered peak Greek literature. And Pindar tells us explicitly that Poseidon fell in love with Pelops when the boy was young, abducted him to Olympus, and made him his beloved. Picture Pelops as a youth in his father's palace. Dark, curly hair in the Greek style, athletic build because aristocratic boys trained constantly, skin bronzed by the Mediterranean sun. He had that particular beauty that made the gods take notice, the kind that transcended mere physical appearance to become something almost divine itself. And Poseidon, god of the sea, saw him and wanted him with the intensity that gods bring to all their passions. The myths tell us Poseidon took Pelops to Olympus on his chariot pulled by immortal horses. The sea god gave him nectar and ambrosia, the food of the gods that granted immortality. He showered him with gifts, attention, affection. According to ancient sources, Poseidon loved him with burning desire and enjoyed his company both in feasting and in the bedchamber. The Greeks weren't subtle about this. They used eros to describe Poseidon's passion, that overwhelming romantic and physical love. But here's where the story gets complicated, because Pelops' father Tantalus was about to commit one of the most grotesque acts in all of mythology. Tantalus, for reasons that remain baffling even by Greek mythological standards, decided to test whether the gods could be fooled. He killed his own son Pelops, butchered the body, cooked it, and served it to the gods at a feast. The gods, being gods, immediately recognized what they were being served. All of them refused to eat, except Demeter, who was distracted by grief over her missing daughter Persephone, and absently ate a shoulder before realizing what she was consuming. The gods were horrified and furious. Zeus immediately punished Tantalus with his eternal torment in Tartarus. But what about Pelops? This is where Poseidon's love becomes crucial to the story. The gods gathered the pieces of Pelops and restored him to life, because apparently gods can do that if the death was particularly unjust. But the shoulder that Demeter had eaten was missing, and Poseidon, who loved Pelops, crafted a replacement shoulder from ivory, gleaming, perfect, fitted so seamlessly that it looked and functioned exactly like the original. Pelops was restored to life, more beautiful than before, now with an ivory shoulder that marked him as someone the gods themselves had remade. And Poseidon's love for him apparently intensified because the sea god gave him even more gifts, including a team of immortal horses and a golden chariot, gifts that would become central to what happened next. Eventually, Pelops left Olympus, whether by his own choice or divine necessity, the sources vary, and travelled to Greece seeking to make his fortune. He heard about Hippodamia, princess of Pisa in the Peloponnese, who was famously beautiful and whose father, King Oenomaus, had declared that any man who wanted to marry her had to beat him in a chariot race. The stakes were absolute: win and marry the princess, lose and be executed. Oenomaus had a team of divine horses gifted by Ares, and he'd killed 13 suitors already, displaying their heads outside his palace as a warning. Pelops, young and ambitious and possessing both immortal horses and the favour of a god, decided to compete. But here's what makes this interesting. Before the race, Pelops prayed to Poseidon, and the ancient sources, particularly Pindar, describe this prayer in terms that make the relationship absolutely clear. Pelops appeals to Poseidon based on their past intimacy, their love. In Pindar's words, Pelops reminds Poseidon of the sweet gifts of Aphrodite they shared, which is Greek poetry's way of saying they'd been lovers. He asks Poseidon to help him now, for the sake of what they'd once meant to each other. and Poseidon, hearing his former beloved's prayer, helped. He gave Pelops advice, ensured his divine horses ran true, and according to some versions, actively sabotaged Oenomaus's chariot. During the race, when Oenomaus's chariot wheels, or the linchpins holding them on, failed, the chariot crashed. Oenomaus died in the wreck. Pelops won. He married Hippodamia and became king of the region that would literally be named after him, the Peloponnese, Pelops' island, the large peninsula that forms southern Greece. His descendants would become the house of Atreus, Thyestes, Agamemnon, Menelaus, Orestes. Basically everyone important in the Trojan War and its aftermath traced their lineage to Pelops. This dynasty, as any student of Greek tragedy knows, was spectacularly cursed. Atreus and Thyestes committed horrific acts against each other. Agamemnon sacrificed his daughter and was murdered by his wife. Orestes killed his mother and was pursued by Furies. The house of Atreus suffered through generations of violence, betrayal, and tragedy, and according to ancient sources, part of that curse stemmed from Pelops' chariot race, specifically that Pelops may have achieved victory through deception and murder rather than honest competition. Some versions say he bribed Oenomaus's charioteer Myrtilus to sabotage the king's chariot, then murdered Myrtilus to cover up the crime. Myrtilus's dying curse echoed through generations. But what's fascinating is that Pelops' relationship with Poseidon remained a celebrated part of Greek culture. The ancient Greeks held the Olympic Games in Pelops' honor. His shrine at Olympia, the Pelopion, was one of the most important religious sites in Greece. People made sacrifices there for centuries, and the story of Poseidon's love for Pelops was part of the official Olympic tradition. Pindar's first Olympian ode, performed at the Olympic Games, tells this story explicitly. It was public performance heard by crowds, celebrating Poseidon and Pelops' relationship as part of Greek cultural heritage. This wasn't hidden or shameful. This was literally performed at Greece's most important athletic and religious festival. The ivory shoulder became a distinctive marker of Pelops' identity. Ancient writers referenced it constantly. His descendants, the Pelopids, were sometimes called children of the ivory shoulder. Archaeological evidence suggests there was an actual bone relic at Olympia that was claimed to be Pelops' shoulder blade, and pilgrims came to see it. Later, Roman writers like Hyginus retold the story, maintaining all the romantic elements. Medieval scholars studying classical literature encountered this myth and understood it perfectly well. Poseidon loved Pelops, granted him gifts as a lover would, answered his prayers based on their past intimacy. The relationship was central to understanding the myth. So, when modern mythology books tell you about Pelops founding the Peloponnese and starting the cursed house of Atreus, but somehow forget to mention why Poseidon helped him, or mention Poseidon's role, but describe Pelops as merely favoured by the god, that's not scholarly accuracy. That's selective editing. The ancient sources were explicit. Poseidon loved Pelops, took him as his beloved, and later helped him because of that love. Poseidon's other famous male love was Nereids, and this story is shorter but equally clear in ancient sources. Nereids was a sea deity, son of Nereus and Doris, which made him one of the Nereids. Though notably Nereids was male, unlike his 50 sisters who were the famous Nereid nymphs of the sea. Aelian, a Roman author who compiled Greek stories, tells us that Nereids was extraordinarily beautiful and that Poseidon loved him. They lived together in the ocean depths, in Poseidon's underwater palace that was described in Homer as more magnificent than anything on land. The relationship was apparently quite stable and happy, unusual for Greek myths, where divine romances typically end in transformation or tragedy. The problem came from Aphrodite. According to the story, Aphrodite also loved Nereids, or at least desired him. Some versions say Nereids was originally her attendant before Poseidon fell for him. When Nereids chose Poseidon over Aphrodite, the goddess of love was not pleased. Rejection apparently didn't sit well with the deity, whose entire domain was desire and attraction. Aphrodite transformed Nereids into a shellfish, specifically what we now call a sea snail or marine gastropod. The ancient Greeks called these Nereids, and that's where the name came from. So every spiral shell on the beach, every sea snail in tide pools, was a reminder of Poseidon's beautiful lover whom Aphrodite had transformed out of spite. But the story doesn't end with simple transformation, because Poseidon, grieving the loss of Nereids' human, or at least humanoid form, did what gods do when they can't reverse a transformation. He made it meaningful. According to myth, Poseidon decreed that Nereid shells would be used in sea travel. Some versions suggest they were used for navigation, others that sailors wore them as good luck charms. The shells became sacred to Poseidon, objects that connected mortals to the sea god's realm. It's a smaller story than Pelops, less connected to major mythological events, but it serves an important function in Greek mythology's explanatory role. The Greeks loved origin stories, why the seasons change, why there are spiders, why certain flowers exist. The story of Nereids explained why these particular shells existed and why they were associated with Poseidon's worship. And notably, ancient sources tell this story matter-of-factly. Poseidon loved Nereids. Aphrodite was jealous. Transformation happened. There's no ambiguity about the romantic nature of the relationship. No suggestion that this was merely divine favoritism or patron deity interest. Aeolian uses language that makes the romantic and physical nature clear. The story also gives us interesting insight into how the Greeks understood divine relationships. Aphrodite, goddess of love, is portrayed as capable of jealousy and spite when rejected. Poseidon, powerful lord of the sea, can't override another god's transformation, but can honor his lover's memory. And Nereids himself, beautiful and desired by multiple deities, has agency in choosing which god he prefers. He chooses Poseidon, and that choice has consequences. Beyond Pelops and Nereids, ancient sources reference other young men who caught Poseidon's attention. The poet and scholar Athenaeus, writing in the 2nd century AD, mentions that Poseidon was known for his love of beautiful youths. Various minor myths reference Poseidon's attraction to or relationships with mortal men, though these stories survive only in fragments or brief mentions. What's significant is the pattern across all three Olympian brothers. Zeus loved Ganymede and others. Poseidon loved Pelops and Nereids and others. Even Hades, lord of the underworld, has myths involving male lovers, though those are less prominent in surviving sources. The three most powerful gods in the Greek pantheon all had male lovers, and this was simply accepted as part of their nature. The Greeks understood sexuality as more fluid than modern Western culture often does. They didn't categorize people as straight or gay. Those concepts didn't exist in ancient Greece. Instead, they focused on roles and behaviors in specific contexts. A man could marry a woman and father children while also having male lovers, and Greek society saw nothing contradictory in this. The gods reflected this cultural understanding. Poseidon's love for Pelops specifically influenced major religious practices. The Olympic Games, held at Olympia every 4 years, were partly in honor of Zeus, but also honored Pelops. The Pelopian shrine was central to Olympic religious ritual. Athletes made offerings there. The connection between Poseidon's divine favor and Pelops' founding of this dynasty was part of Olympic tradition. When ancient Greek aristocrats wanted to trace prestigious lineage, connecting themselves to Pelops, and thus to Poseidon's favor, was highly desirable. The Peloponnese was literally named after him. The Pelopid dynasty, despite its tragic trajectory, represented power and divine connection, and everyone knew that Poseidon's love for Pelops was the foundation of that divine connection. Roman writers absorbed these myths along with Greek culture generally. Ovid, Hyginus, Claudian, and others retold these stories, maintaining the romantic elements. Renaissance scholars studying classical literature encountered these myths constantly. They were part of the standard classical education. The artistic tradition is equally clear. Ancient Greek pottery shows scenes from Pelops' story, often highlighting his beauty and divine favor. Roman mosaics depicted him. Renaissance and neoclassical artists painted him, sometimes focusing on the moment Poseidon first saw him, sometimes on the chariot race, sometimes on the ivory shoulder. What's remarkable is how long this knowledge persisted before modern discomfort set in. 18th and 19th century classical scholars understood these myths perfectly well. They might couch descriptions in careful language, but they knew what the ancient sources said. It's primarily in 20th century popular retellings, children's mythology books, school curricula, mass market adaptations, that these relationships suddenly became ambiguous or disappeared entirely. But the ancient sources remain. Pindar's odes are still studied in universities. Ovid's Metamorphoses is still considered foundational Latin literature. The myths are right there, explicit and clear, waiting for anyone willing to read them as written rather than as edited. Poseidon's character in mythology is often associated with raw power, earthquakes, storms, the untamable sea. But these love stories show another dimension: divine beings capable of genuine affection, making gifts to their beloveds, answering prayers based on past intimacy, honoring transformed lovers through sacred objects. The god who could destroy coastal cities with a wave also crafted an ivory shoulder with enough care that it was indistinguishable from flesh. That complexity, power and tenderness, rage and love, is what makes these myths psychologically rich. The Greek gods weren't one-dimensional. They were complicated, contradictory, recognizably human in their emotions despite their divine power. Poseidon could be both the terrifying force that destroyed Odysseus' ships and the devoted lover who helped Pelops win his bride. As we prepare to move on to our next deity, it's worth remembering that we're only 3 gods into this journey, and already we've encountered multiple explicit same-sex relationships that shaped major mythological events, influenced religious practices, and remained celebrated in Greek culture for over 1,000 years. And we're far from done. Next, we meet perhaps the most fascinating figure in the entire pantheon when it comes to sexuality and gender, Dionysus, the god who broke every rule, crossed every boundary, and loved whomever he pleased. Chapter 4: Dionysus, the gender-fluid god. If the other Olympian gods operated within certain expected boundaries, even when those boundaries included abducting beautiful mortals or starting wars over romantic disputes, Dionysus existed to shatter every boundary the Greeks thought they understood. God of wine, ecstasy, theatre and transformation, Dionysus was the divine embodiment of fluidity itself. He crossed borders between civilization and wilderness, sanity and madness, male and female, mortal and divine. And when it came to love and sexuality, Dionysus was gloriously, deliberately, provocatively unconstrained. The ancient Greeks portrayed Dionysus as fundamentally different from the other gods. Apollo was masculine perfection, all golden beauty and athletic grace. Ares was hyper-masculine warrior energy. Zeus exuded paternal authority. But Dionysus, ancient art shows him as almost androgynous, long flowing hair, soft features, often dressed in flowing robes that could belong to any gender, sometimes depicted with distinctly feminine characteristics despite being male. He was beautiful in a way that transcended masculine or feminine categorization. And this wasn't accidental. This was intentional characterization by a culture that generally had very rigid gender roles. The Greeks made Dionysus gender fluid, in a society where men and women had separate social spheres, where masculinity was carefully performed and defended. Dionysus's willingness to blur these lines made him both fascinating and frightening to the Greeks. He represented liberation from social constraint, which is intoxicating and dangerous in equal measure. His love life reflected this boundary-crossing nature. Dionysus loved women, Ariadne most famously, whom he married after Theseus abandoned her. But he also loved men, and those relationships were just as important to his mythology and cult worship. Let's explore the god who proved that the rules didn't apply to everyone. The most detailed love story involving Dionysus and a male lover comes from the poet Nonnus, who wrote the Dionysiaca in the 5th century AD, late for classical mythology, but drawing on much older traditions. The story of Ampelos is lengthy, romantic, and ultimately tragic in the way that Greek love stories so often are. Ampelos was a satyr, one of those half-human, half-goat creatures associated with Dionysus's wild retinue. But Ampelos wasn't like the other satyrs, who were generally portrayed as lustful, drunken, and comically grotesque. Ampelos was beautiful. Nonnus dedicates extensive passages to describing his appearance, graceful despite the goat legs, handsome face, youth and vitality, athletic build. He was a satyr who looked more like a youth of extraordinary beauty who happened to have some goat-like characteristics. Dionysus encountered Ampelos in the forests and mountains where the god spent much of his time before being fully accepted on Olympus. This was during Dionysus's wandering years, when he travelled the world teaching mortals the cultivation of grapes and wine, gathering his ecstatic followers, essentially establishing his worship through direct contact with humanity. And Dionysus fell completely, utterly in love with Ampelos. Nonnus describes their relationship with language that leaves absolutely no ambiguity. Dionysus is besotted, devoted, constantly in Ampelos's company. They spend their days together in the wilderness, hunting, exploring, wrestling. The Greeks loved wrestling as both sport and courtship ritual, swimming in forest streams. Dionysus shows Ampelos the arts of winemaking, shares divine knowledge, gives him gifts. The god who could have anything or anyone chooses to spend his time with this beautiful satyr. The text describes them sharing a bed, embracing Dionysus's hands in Ampelos's hair. Nonnus uses eros and related terms. This is explicitly romantic and physical love, not merely friendship or divine patronage. Dionysus loves Ampelos the way the gods love their mortal favourites, with passion and intensity, and the kind of attention that makes the beloved the centre of the divine universe. They were happy together in the way mythology rarely allows, days of simple pleasures, the kind of pastoral idyll that Greek poetry often described as the ideal life. No grand quests, no interference from other gods yet, just two beings who loved each other enjoying existence. But this is Greek mythology, where happiness is always temporary. One day, Ampelos decided he wanted to climb a tall elm tree to pick grapes from the grapevines growing up its trunk. Dionysus, for once, felt a premonition of danger. He tried to dissuade Ampelos, suggested they find grapes elsewhere, offered to get them himself. But Ampelos, young and confident and probably wanting to impress his divine lover, climbed the tree anyway. The branch broke, Ampelos fell, and despite being a satyr, a creature of the wild, supernaturally hardy, the fall killed him. Dionysus's grief was overwhelming. Nonnus describes the god cradling Ampelos's body, weeping, crying out to the fates to reverse death. He raged against the tree that had killed his beloved. He considered giving up his divine duties entirely. So complete was his despair. The god of joy and wine and celebration became the god of mourning. But then, and this is where the story becomes distinctly Dionysian, the fates took pity, or perhaps they recognized that Ampelos's death served a purpose. They transformed Ampelos's body into the first grapevine. His blood became wine. Think about the symbolism here. Ampelos, whom Dionysus loved, becomes the source of wine itself, the substance most associated with Dionysus, the drink that brings joy and ecstasy and divine inspiration. Every time someone drinks wine, they're partaking of Ampelos. Every grape harvest, every vintage, every symposium where wine flows freely, it all connects back to Dionysus's lost lover. Dionysus, rather than being destroyed by grief, transformed it into something that would bring pleasure to humanity forever. Wine becomes not just a drink, but a memorial, a way of keeping Ampelos present. And Dionysus, god of wine, carries his lover with him in everything he does. His entire divine domain becomes an act of remembrance. This story echoes the pattern we've seen with Apollo and Hyacinthus. Beloved dies, God transforms them into something that will last forever. But there's something distinctly different about the Dionysian version. The hyacinth is beautiful but peripheral to Apollo's worship. Wine is central to everything Dionysus represents. Ampelos didn't become a memorial separate from Dionysus's identity. He became integrated into it. The ancient Greeks who knew this story understood something profound about wine in their culture. The symposium, the drinking party where men reclined together, drank, discussed philosophy, engaged in romance, was a space where normal social rules loosened. Wine broke down barriers. It made people honest, emotional, uninhibited. In that context, Wine originating from a love story between a god and a satyr makes perfect sense. The drink itself embodies the boundary-crossing nature of Dionysian experience. Nonnus's text is late, but references to Ampelos appear in earlier sources. The story was known, told, referenced. Vase paintings show Dionysus with a beautiful young satyr companion. The connection between Dionysus, Ampelos, and wine was part of the god's mythology. Another male lover of Dionysus appears in a story that ancient sources tell with remarkable frankness, though modern retellings tend to avoid it entirely for reasons that will become obvious. When Dionysus needed to descend to the underworld to rescue his mother Semele, who had died before Dionysus was born, in yet another tragedy caused by Hera's jealousy of Zeus's lovers, he didn't know the way. The underworld has many entrances, and finding the right one requires local knowledge. He encountered a mortal man named Prosimnus, sometimes called Polymnus in different sources, who knew where the entrance was. Prosimnus agreed to show Dionysus the way, but he wanted something in return. According to the ancient writer Clement of Alexandria, who preserved this story specifically to criticize pagan religious practices, Prosimnus's price was sexual. He wanted Dionysus to sleep with him when the god returned from the underworld. Dionysus agreed. Prosimnus showed him the entrance, and Dionysus descended to Hades, successfully found his mother Semele, and brought her up to Olympus where Zeus made her a goddess. Mission accomplished. But when Dionysus returned to fulfill his promise to Prosimnus, he found that the mortal had died while Dionysus was in the underworld. So Dionysus couldn't keep his promise in the conventional way. Instead, and this is where the story gets remarkably explicit in ancient sources, Dionysus carved a phallus from the fig wood and used it to fulfill his promise symbolically at Prosimnus's grave. This story, which Clement of Alexandria recorded because he found it scandalous evidence of pagan immorality, was apparently part of actual Dionysian religious practice. Some Dionysian rituals involved phallic symbols made from fig wood, and this myth provided the religious explanation for that practice. The phallus was sacred to Dionysus, featured prominently in his festivals and processions, and this origin story connected that symbolism to the god's relationship with a male lover. Modern sensibilities find this story shocking, which is probably why it rarely appears in mythology collections. But for the ancient Greeks, it wasn't particularly shocking at all. Dionysian worship was explicitly sexual in many forms. The god represented fertility, ecstasy, the breaking of social constraint. Phallic processions were standard elements of his festivals. This story simply provided mythological context for existing religious practice. What's interesting is that Dionysus honors his promise even though Prosimnus is dead. The god could have simply shrugged and walked away. Prosimnus wasn't around to complain. But Dionysus finds a way to fulfill his word, even if unconventionally. There's something almost touching about that, the god's determination to honor an agreement made with a mortal lover. The story also shows Dionysus as someone who makes bargains, who negotiates rather than simply taking what he wants. Unlike Zeus's abductions or Poseidon's overwhelming of mortal resistance, Dionysus makes an agreement with Prosimnus and then keeps it. There's an element of equality there, unusual in divine mortal interactions. Beyond specific love stories, Dionysus's entire mythology and cult worship was saturated with gender transgression and sexual fluidity. His followers, the Maenads or Bacchantes, were primarily women, which was unusual in Greek religion where most major cults were gender segregated. These women would leave their homes, abandon their traditional domestic roles, and run wild in the mountains in ecstatic worship, hunting animals with their bare hands, achieving supernatural strength through divine possession. But men could also join Dionysian worship, and when they did, they often wore women's clothing and adopted feminine characteristics. Dionysus himself was sometimes depicted wearing women's robes with long flowing hair, with physical characteristics that ancient art associated with femininity. He was described as pseudonor, false male, or not quite male in some texts. The worship of Dionysus involved role reversal, gender bending, and the temporary suspension of normal social categories. Men could express femininity, women could express wild, aggressive behavior normally associated with masculinity, and everyone was encouraged to lose themselves in ecstatic experience that transcended ordinary identity. This made Dionysus deeply appealing to anyone who felt constrained by normal social categories, and also deeply threatening to those invested in maintaining social order. Several Greek myths involve cities that refuse to acknowledge Dionysus and suffer terrible consequences when the god forces recognition. The Bacchae by Euripides is the most famous example, where King Pentheus refuses to allow Dionysian worship in Thebes and is literally torn apart by Maenads, including his own mother, after Dionysus drives them mad. The subtext is clear. You cannot suppress Dionysus. You cannot control ecstatic experience. You cannot maintain rigid social boundaries against the god who exists to dissolve boundaries. And that includes sexual boundaries, gender boundaries, the boundaries between acceptable and transgressive behavior. In historical Athens, Dionysian festivals like the city Dionysia and Anthesteria involved significant gender mixing and sexual freedom. The phallus processions were explicit celebrations of sexuality. Theatre, which was itself a form of Dionysian worship, involved men performing as women, exploring identity through performance, telling stories that questioned social norms. Dionysus represented everything that mainstream Greek society tried to regulate: intoxication, sexual freedom, emotional extremes, gender transgression, loss of self-control. His worship provided a sanctioned release valve where people could temporarily experience freedoms denied in ordinary life. And his mythology, including his male lovers, was part of that larger pattern of boundary crossing. Some scholars argue that Dionysus was particularly important to people who didn't fit neatly into Greek social categories: women frustrated by domestic constraint, men who didn't conform to masculine ideals, anyone whose sexuality or gender expression was marginal. The god, who was himself fluid, offered divine validation to human fluidity. Dionysus's queerness, using queer here in its academic sense of departing from normative categories, was central to his identity in ancient worship. This wasn't peripheral, this was definitional. A Dionysus stripped of gender fluidity and sexual transgression isn't really Dionysus anymore. Yet modern popular culture often presents Dionysus as basically just the party god, or the wine god, emphasizing his association with drinking and celebration, while quietly removing everything that made him culturally significant. The gender fluidity disappears, the male lovers vanish, the sexual elements of his worship get sanitized into vague fertility rites. Even in adaptations that keep Dionysus's more challenging aspects, there's often a tendency to make him chaotic or crazy rather than genuinely transgressive. Making him mad or wild or unpredictable is safer than acknowledging that he represented a fundamental challenge to social order, particularly around gender and sexuality. But the ancient sources are clear. Dionysus loved both women and men. He was portrayed as gender fluid. His worship involved explicit sexuality, gender transgression, and social reversal. These weren't bugs in the system. They were features. They were the point. The Ampelos story survives in Nonnus's lengthy text, where anyone can read about Dionysus's passionate love for the beautiful satyr. The Prosimnus story exists in Clement of Alexandria's writings, preserved by a Christian critic who wanted to demonstrate pagan impropriety. The artistic evidence, vases, sculptures, mosaics, shows Dionysus in all his androgynous glory. The historical records describe the actual practices of Dionysian festivals. None of this is secret or hidden. It's just often ignored in popular retellings that prefer a sanitized, simplified mythology. What's particularly interesting is that Dionysus's fluidity made him enduringly popular, even as Greek culture gave way to Roman and then Christian dominance. The Romans adopted him enthusiastically as Bacchus, keeping most of his transgressive characteristics. Dionysian imagery persisted in art for centuries. Renaissance artists painted him constantly, often emphasizing his androgynous beauty and sexual nature. There's something universal about a deity who embodies freedom from constraint. Every culture has rigid rules about gender, sexuality, and appropriate behavior. And every culture seems to need some sanctioned space where those rules can be temporarily suspended. Dionysus was the divine patron of that space, and his mythology reflects the deep human need for liberation, transformation, and ecstatic experience beyond everyday identity. As we move from Dionysus to the mortal heroes who loved other men, we're shifting from divine to human realms. The gods could transgress boundaries with relative impunity. Divine power offers certain privileges. But mortal men who loved each other faced the same challenges mortals always face: death, separation, the cruelty of fate, the judgment of society. Yet some of these relationships became so legendary that millennia later we're still telling their stories. Next we turn to the greatest heroes of the Trojan War and the labours of Heracles, where male love created partnerships that defined Greek ideas of heroism itself. Chapter 5: The Heroes, Achilles, Heracles, and Others. If the gods could love whom they pleased from the safety of immortality and divine power, mortal heroes faced more complicated circumstances. Their relationships existed in the human world of warfare, honor codes, social expectations, and most significantly, death. Yet some of the most celebrated partnerships in all of Greek mythology were between male heroes, relationships so central to their stories that removing them fundamentally changes the narrative. These weren't minor details that ancient writers mentioned in passing. These were foundational relationships that motivated entire epics, explained heroic deeds, and represented Greek ideals of male excellence and devotion. The ancient Greeks celebrated these partnerships in their greatest literature, taught them to students, honored them in religious ritual, and held them up as examples of the highest form of love and loyalty. Modern retellings often struggle with these relationships, either erasing them entirely, reducing them to vague friendship, or insisting there's scholarly debate about their nature. But the ancient Greeks themselves had no such confusion. They knew what these relationships were, they approved of them, and they wove them into the very fabric of their heroic tradition. The Iliad, Homer's epic poem about the Trojan War, is one of the foundational texts of Western literature. Written sometime in the 8th century BC, drawing on much older oral traditions, it's been continuously studied for nearly 3,000 years. Every generation of scholars, poets, and students has read it. And at its emotional core is the relationship between Achilles and Patroclus. The basic story is well known. Achilles, greatest of Greek warriors, withdraws from fighting after a dispute with Agamemnon over a captured woman. While Achilles sulks in his tent, the Trojans gain advantage, driving the Greeks back to their ships. Patroclus, desperate to help, borrows Achilles' armor and leads the Myrmidons into battle. Hector kills him. Achilles, grief-stricken and enraged, returns to battle and kills Hector in revenge, knowing this action will lead to his own prophesied death. That's the plot. But the emotional weight, the reason this story has resonated for millennia, is the relationship between Achilles and Patroclus. Homer doesn't explicitly label their relationship using specific Greek terms for lovers, which has allowed centuries of scholars to argue they were just friends, or comrades in arms, or like brothers. But Homer doesn't need to label it explicitly, because the entire text demonstrates the nature of their bond through actions, emotions, and the cultural context every ancient Greek reader would have understood immediately. Let's look at what Homer actually shows us. Achilles and Patroclus share a tent and sleep in the same space, with their respective female captives nearby. In Greek military culture, this arrangement, two men sharing intimate quarters, was common for lovers. Comrades had their own tents, brothers would have their own tents, but lovers shared space. When Patroclus dies, Achilles' grief is described in language Homer uses elsewhere for the loss of spouses. Achilles tears his hair, covers himself in dust, lies on the ground refusing food, contemplates suicide. He says he won't bury Patroclus until he's brought Hector's head, and he won't cut his own hair, a ritual gesture, until Patroclus is avenged. This is profound, intimate grief, not the mourning of a fallen comrade. At Patroclus' funeral, Achilles sacrifices 12 Trojan prisoners, cuts his own hair, and places it in Patroclus' hands, and organizes elaborate funeral games in his honor. Later sources tell us Achilles requested that when he died, his ashes be mingled with Patroclus's in the same urn. They would be literally inseparable for eternity. Achilles returns to battle knowing he will die. The prophecy is clear. If he kills Hector, his own death will follow soon after. He chooses death to avenge Patroclus. That's not a military decision or a strategic choice. That's love overriding self-preservation. But the most telling evidence isn't in the Iliad itself. It's in how every ancient Greek reader and writer understood the relationship. Plato, in his Symposium, written 385 BC, about 300 years after Homer, has his characters explicitly discuss Achilles and Patroclus as lovers. One speaker says that Achilles was the beloved, Eromenos, and Patroclus the lover, Erastes, though another argues the reverse. They debate which one was older, which was more beautiful, who loved whom more, but none of them question that it was a romantic and physical relationship. That's simply assumed. Aeschylus, the great Athenian tragedian, wrote a trilogy of plays about Achilles, mostly lost now, but referenced by other ancient writers, in which Achilles and Patroclus were explicitly lovers. One fragment mentions the frequent kisses they shared. Aeschines, an Athenian orator, in a 4th century BC speech, references the godlike Achilles and Patroclus as an example of noble love between men, contrasting them with lesser relationships. He's using them as a positive moral example in a court case. The point is, for the entire period when the Iliad was being composed, performed, and read in ancient Greece, roughly 800 BC to 300 BC and beyond, Greeks understood Achilles and Patroclus as lovers. There was no ambiguity. Modern ambiguity is a later invention. Some scholars argue that the lack of explicit sexual language in Homer means the relationship wasn't physical. But Homer doesn't describe anyone's sex life explicitly. The Iliad isn't that kind of text. Homer shows relationships through behavior, emotion, and context. By those measures, Achilles and Patroclus are clearly in the most significant relationship of either man's life. It's also worth noting that both men have female captives who are explicitly described as sexual partners. Achilles has Briseis, the woman whose removal sparks his conflict with Agamemnon. Patroclus has Iphis. The Greeks didn't see any contradiction in men having both female sexual partners and a primary male romantic relationship. Those were simply different types of relationships, serving different purposes. What makes Achilles and Patroclus' story so powerful isn't just that they loved each other, it's that their love literally changes the course of the Trojan War. Without Patroclus' death, Achilles doesn't return to battle. Without Achilles returning to battle, Hector doesn't die. The entire tragic arc of the war's final days hinges on Achilles' love for Patroclus and his grief at losing him. This is a relationship that motivates one of the central narratives of Western literature. It's not a footnote, it's not subtext, it's the emotional engine of the story. Later writers continued elaborating on their relationship. In the 1st century AD, the Greek historian Philostratus wrote that Achilles and Patroclus were honoured as lovers in various hero shrines across Greece. Lucian, the satirist, referenced their relationship as common knowledge. When Alexander the Great visited Troy, he laid wreaths at Achilles' supposed tomb, while his companion Hephaestion laid wreaths at Patroclus's, a gesture every ancient observer understood as Alexander and Hephaestion, identifying their own relationship with that of Achilles and Patroclus. So when modern retellings insist Achilles and Patroclus were just very close friends or like brothers, or suggest their relationship is open to interpretation, that's not scholarly caution. That's actively contradicting how the ancient Greeks themselves understood their own literature. If Achilles and Patroclus represent tragic romantic devotion, Heracles and Iolaus represent something different, the working partnership, the companion who stands beside you through impossible challenges, the relationship built on shared ordeal and mutual support. Heracles, Hercules to the Romans, was the greatest hero in Greek mythology. Son of Zeus and the mortal woman Alcmene, possessed of superhuman strength, he performed the 12 labours, defeated countless monsters, and eventually achieved immortality. His mythology is vast. His adventures span the entire Mediterranean, and throughout much of it, Iolaus was by his side. Iolaus was Heracles' nephew, son of Heracles' mortal twin brother Iphicles. He was younger than Heracles, described as a beautiful youth when they first meet, and he became Heracles' charioteer, companion, and according to multiple ancient sources, lover. The relationship is most prominent in the stories of the 12 labours, particularly the second labour, slaying the Lernaean Hydra. The Hydra was a multi-headed serpent monster. When you cut off one head, 2 grew back. Heracles couldn't defeat it alone, he needed help. Iolaus provided that help, cauterizing each neck stump with fire as Heracles cut off the heads, preventing regeneration. Together they defeated a monster that neither could have beaten alone. This pattern repeats throughout Heracles' adventures. Iolaus isn't just present as a helper, he's an essential partner. Ancient writers consistently mention him, describe his contributions, and portray the relationship between him and Heracles as deeply affectionate. Plutarch, writing in the 1st century AD, explicitly identifies Iolaus as Heracles' eromenos, beloved in the technical sense of the younger partner in a formalized Greek male relationship. Plutarch mentions that male couples in Thebes would go to Iolaus' tomb to swear oaths of loyalty to each other, seeking his blessing on their own relationships. Iolaus had a hero shrine in Thebes, and it functioned as a place for male lovers to sanctify their unions. Think about that for a moment. Actual historical Greek men in actual historical Thebes visited Iolaus' tomb to honor their own relationships, invoking him as a patron of male love. This continued for centuries. This wasn't mythology in the abstract. This was active religious practice connecting mythology to lived experience. The playwright Aristophanes references Iolaus' relationship with Heracles in his comedies. Aristotle mentions it in his Constitution of the Athenians when discussing Theban customs. This was common knowledge, widely accepted, mentioned casually in various contexts because it was simply part of Heracles' mythology. Heracles had many relationships. He married multiple times, fathered numerous children, had various male and female lovers. His sexuality was as extensive as his adventures. But Iolaus remained constant throughout the labours, the one person Heracles consistently relied on when facing impossible challenges. There's something particularly touching about this relationship, in contrast to Heracles' overall tragic life. Heracles was cursed by Hera from birth, driven mad, and caused to kill his own wife and children, enslaved to perform the 12 labours as penance, eventually killed by his wife's unintentional poisoning. His life is one long sequence of suffering punctuated by incredible feats. But through much of it, Iolaus was there, loyal, supportive, capable. The ancient Greeks valued this type of partnership highly. The idea that lovers made better warriors, that men fought harder to protect and impress their beloveds, that shared ordeal created unbreakable bonds. These concepts were central to Greek ideas about male relationships. Heracles and Iolaus embodied that ideal, the partnership that made both men better, stronger, more capable than either would be alone. Later sources describe Iolaus eventually marrying and having his own heroic career, but his association with Heracles remained his primary mythological identity. He was Iolaus, Heracles' companion, and everyone knew what that meant. Theseus, the great Athenian hero who killed the Minotaur and unified Attica, had a famous partnership with Pirithous, king of the Lapiths. Their relationship is often described as friendship in modern retellings, and ancient sources do use philia, affectionate friendship, to describe their bond. But the intensity of their connection, the nature of their adventures together, and the cultural context suggest something deeper than casual friendship. They met as potential enemies. Pirithous had raided Athenian territory. Theseus came to confront him, but upon seeing each other, they were so impressed that they became instant devoted companions. Plutarch describes their meeting with language suggesting immediate, intense connection, almost love at first sight. They swore oaths of eternal friendship and proceeded to have a series of adventures together, including attempting to abduct Helen. Yes, that Helen, though she was only a child at this point. This particular adventure was not the Greeks' finest moment, and later attempting to kidnap Persephone from the underworld itself. The Persephone plan went badly. Hades trapped them, and while Theseus was eventually rescued by Heracles, Pirithous remained trapped forever. The relationship between Theseus and Pirithous was held up as an ideal of male companionship. They're regularly referenced together in ancient sources as examples of devoted friendship. But the Greeks didn't draw hard lines between friendship and romance the way modern culture often does. Intense bonds between men existed on a spectrum, and the cultural institutions that formalized male-male relationships included elements of both what we'd call friendship and what we'd call romance. Some ancient sources hint at more explicitly romantic elements to their relationship, though these references are less clear than with Achilles and Patroclus or Heracles and Iolaus. What's undeniable is that their bond was considered exceptionally deep, that they were literally willing to invade the underworld for each other, or at least for Pirithous' romantic ambitions, and that they represented an ideal of male partnership. Orestes, son of Agamemnon and Clytemnestra, had one of the most traumatic mythological lives imaginable. His mother murdered his father. He murdered his mother in revenge. He was pursued by Furies for matricide. He faced trial, potential execution, and ongoing divine punishment. Through all of this, his companion Pylades stood beside him. The relationship between Orestes and Pylades was portrayed as absolute devotion. Pylades accompanied Orestes into exile, helped him plan and execute revenge, stood with him at trial, and in various versions of the myth, literally volunteered to die in Orestes' place. Euripides wrote plays featuring both characters, the Iphigenia in Taurus and Orestes, where their relationship is central. In Iphigenia in Taurus, when both are about to be sacrificed, each tries to save the other. In Orestes, Pylades remains loyal despite Orestes being condemned by the city and pursued by Furies. Later, Greek writers explicitly identified them as lovers. Lucian lists them alongside Achilles and Patroclus as famous devoted pairs. Aelian mentions them as an example of extraordinary loyalty between male lovers. Again, this was common cultural knowledge, referenced casually because everyone understood the relationship. Pylades eventually married Orestes' sister Electra, which ancient Greeks saw as cementing the bond between the two men rather than contradicting it. Male-male relationships and marriage to women weren't mutually exclusive categories. We need to briefly step outside pure mythology into actual history, because the Greeks took their ideals about male love and partnership and created something remarkable, the sacred band of Thebes. In 378 BC, the Theban military commander Gorgidas formed an elite unit of 150 pairs of male lovers, 300 men total. The theory, drawn from Plato and Greek cultural beliefs, was that men would fight harder alongside their lovers than alongside random comrades. They'd fight to protect their beloved, fight to impress their beloved, and prefer death to showing cowardice before someone they loved. It worked. The sacred band was essentially undefeated for 40 years. They broke Spartan military dominance at the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC. Sparta, which had been considered militarily invincible, lost decisively to a force that included these 150 couples. The sacred band fought as an elite shock unit, and they were devastatingly effective. They were finally defeated by Philip II of Macedonia at the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC. Plutarch records that Philip, surveying the battlefield afterward, found the sacred band's bodies lying where they'd formed their last stand, none having retreated, many with wounds to the front, meaning they'd faced their enemies rather than running. Philip supposedly wept, saying, "Perish any man who suspects that these men either did or suffered anything unseemly." Even an enemy recognized and honored their devotion. A monument was erected at Chaeronea, and in 1880, archaeologists discovered a mass grave containing the remains of 254 warriors, almost certainly the sacred band. They'd been buried with honor by the Macedonians who defeated them. This is where mythology informed reality. The Greeks believed the stories about Achilles and Patroclus, about Heracles and Iolaus, about the power of love between male warriors. So they created a military unit based on that principle, and it became one of the most effective fighting forces in Greek history. These heroic partnerships, Achilles and Patroclus, Heracles and Iolaus, Theseus and Pirithous, Orestes and Pylades, weren't peripheral to Greek mythology. They were central examples of heroic virtue. The Greeks held these relationships up as ideals, taught them to young men as examples of loyalty and excellence, honored them in religious ritual, and referenced them constantly in literature and philosophy. When Plato discusses love in the Symposium, he cites these mythological pairs as examples. When Aristotle analyzes friendship and virtue, these relationships provide context. When Greek city-states created elite military units, they drew on these mythological models. The modern tendency to erase or downplay these relationships doesn't just change mythology, it fundamentally misrepresents what the ancient Greeks valued and believed. These were stories about how love between men could inspire the greatest heroism, the deepest loyalty, the most profound sacrifice. That was the point. That's why the Greeks told these stories for over 1,000 years. When we read the Iliad and pretend Achilles and Patroclus were just friends, we miss the emotional core of the epic. When we learn about Heracles but not Iolaus, we lose the partnership that made the 12 Labours possible. When these relationships disappear from modern retellings, we're not getting Greek mythology. We're getting an edited version that reflects modern discomfort, not ancient reality. But the ancient sources remain, waiting to be read as written. And they tell us clearly, the greatest heroes of Greek mythology loved other men. Those relationships were celebrated, and the Greeks saw nothing contradictory between heroic masculinity and romantic love between males. Now, we move from the grand heroic narratives to some lesser-known but equally fascinating tales. The stories that didn't make it into epic poetry, but were told by poets and playwrights, recorded by historians, and remembered in local traditions. Chapter 6. Lesser-known tales and cultural context. The grand narratives of Zeus and Ganymede, Apollo and Hyacinthus, Achilles and Patroclus. These are the stories that survived in epic poetry and in major literary works, preserved by their centrality to Greek culture. But Greek mythology was vast, local and varied. Hundreds of city-states across the Mediterranean had their own myths, their own heroes, their own particular religious traditions, and many of these included same-sex love stories that never made it into the major epics, but were nonetheless important to the communities that told them. Some survived as fragments, a line or two in an obscure poet, a reference in a travel writer's account, a mention in a philosophical dialogue. Others appear in fuller form in later sources, Roman writers preserving Greek traditions, or Byzantine scholars copying ancient manuscripts. What we're left with is a rich tapestry of stories that show us just how pervasive same-sex relationships were throughout Greek mythology. These weren't exceptions or anomalies, they were part of the normal landscape of Greek myth, as unremarkable to ancient audiences as heterosexual love stories. Let's explore some of these lesser-known tales and what they tell us about Greek cultural attitudes. Before we had the story of Oedipus, the man who unknowingly killed his father and married his mother, there was the story of how the curse on the house of Thebes began. And it started with Laius, Oedipus's father, and his relationship with a young man named Chrysippus. Laius was exiled from Thebes as a young man and found refuge at the court of King Pelops. Yes, the same Pelops who was Poseidon's beloved. Greek mythology forms an interconnected web. Pelops hosted Laius generously, and Laius fell in love with Pelops' son Chrysippus, described by various sources as exceptionally beautiful. Here's where the story turns dark. According to the ancient sources, particularly the lost plays of Euripides that are referenced by later writers, Laius either seduced or abducted Chrysippus. The exact nature of the act varies by source. Some suggest consensual relationship that violated hospitality customs. Others describe outright abduction and assault. Chrysippus died, either by suicide from shame, or murdered by his jealous brothers, or killed by Laius depending on which version you read. Pelops cursed Laius for this violation. The curse was specific and terrible. Laius would be killed by his own son, and his house would know only suffering. This curse echoed through generations. Oedipus killed Laius, married his own mother Jocasta. Their children became Antigone and her brothers who killed each other in civil war. The entire tragic cycle of Theban plays stems from Pelops' curse on Laius. What's significant here is that the curse wasn't because Laius loved a man. That wasn't the problem. The problem was violation of xenia, guest-host relationship, one of the most sacred bonds in Greek culture. Pelops had offered Laius hospitality and protection. Laius repaid this by violating Pelops' son. That was the crime, abuse of hospitality and assault, not same-sex attraction. Greek mythology is full of punishments for violating hospitality customs. Paris abducted Helen while guest of Menelaus. That sparked the Trojan War. The suitors abused Odysseus' hospitality in the Odyssey. Odysseus massacred them. Violation of xenia was serious business. Laius' crime was cast in those terms, not in terms of the gender of the people involved. The story also highlights something uncomfortable. Ancient Greek acceptance of male-male relationships didn't mean they had perfect understanding of consent or equality. The Orestes Eromenos system, where older men courted younger ones, had power imbalances built in. Some sources suggest this relationship could be exploitative. The Laius Chrysippus story may represent Greek anxieties about the darker possibilities of these relationships. But what it definitely wasn't was a morality tale about same-sex relationships being wrong. It was a story about violating sacred customs, about assault, about abuse of power and hospitality. Later Christian interpreters sometimes tried to reframe it as divine punishment for sodomy, but that reading contradicts everything else in Greek mythology, where same-sex relationships receive divine approval. Everyone knows the story of Narcissus, the beautiful youth who fell in love with his own reflection and wasted away staring at it, eventually transforming into the flower that bears his name. But the version most people know from Ovid's Metamorphoses focuses on Narcissus rejecting the nymph Echo. Earlier Greek versions tell a different story, involving a male suitor. The poet Conon, writing in the 1st century BC but drawing on older traditions, tells us that Narcissus was pursued by many suitors of both genders, but rejected them all. One persistent suitor was a young man named Amanius, who loved Narcissus desperately. Narcissus, cold and cruel in his beauty, not only rejected Amanius but mocked him and sent him a sword as a gift, a clear suggestion that Amanius should kill himself if he was so distressed. Amanius took the sword to Narcissus's door and did exactly that, praying to Nemesis, goddess of retribution, as he died, that Narcissus would know what it felt like to love without hope. Nemesis heard the prayer. She caused Narcissus to fall in love with his own reflection, unattainable, unable to be possessed, driving him to the same despair he'd inflicted on Amanius. Narcissus wasted away and died, transformed into the flower. This version makes Narcissus's punishment more clearly deserved. He didn't just reject love, he was cruel about it, mocked someone's genuine feelings, and essentially drove that person to suicide. The curse was proportional to his crime. What's interesting is that later retellings increasingly focused on Echo, while the Amanias version faded. By Ovid's time, 1st century AD, the Roman poet chose to emphasize the female suitor, though he mentions that Narcissus rejected youths and maidens both. Modern retellings almost exclusively use Ovid's version, which means the male suitor has been nearly forgotten. But in the original Greek context, Narcissus's rejection of male love was just as significant as his rejection of female love. His crime was cruelty and pride, not which gender he rejected. The story worked the same way whether the spurned lover was male or female. That was the point. The tragic love story of Orpheus and Eurydice is famous. He loved her, she died, he descended to the underworld to retrieve her, almost succeeded, but looked back too soon, lost her forever. But that's where most modern retellings end. The ancient sources continue the story, and it gets interesting. After losing Eurydice for the second time, Orpheus was devastated. According to Ovid and other sources, he swore off women entirely, and instead turned to love of tender boys. Orpheus became associated with introducing the practice of pederastia, formalized relationships between men and youths, to Thrace, the region where he lived. He would sit under trees playing his lyre, and young men would gather to listen, entranced by his music. Ovid describes him surrounded by male admirers in a beautiful grove. This wasn't portrayed negatively, it was simply what Orpheus did after his great tragedy. He found solace in male companionship and love, rather than attempting another relationship with a woman. His end came when the Maenads, female followers of Dionysus, tore him apart. Different sources give different reasons for this murder. Some say the Maenads were angry that Orpheus rejected women. Others say they were acting on Dionysus's orders for reasons unrelated to Orpheus's sexuality. Still others suggest the women of Thrace were jealous of the attention their husbands and sons paid to Orpheus. Whatever the reason for his death, the ancient sources are clear that after Eurydice, Orpheus's romantic and sexual attention turned toward males. This was presented as a major biographical fact about him, not a footnote. He was credited, or blamed, depending on the author, with establishing certain customs regarding male love in Thrace. What's particularly interesting is that Orpheus represents one of the few examples in Greek mythology where a character's sexual orientation apparently changes based on experience. He loved Eurydice intensely, but after losing her, turned exclusively to males. The Greeks didn't see this as contradictory or psychologically implausible. People's desires and behaviors could shift based on circumstance and experience. Thamyris was a legendary Thracian poet and musician, so skilled that he challenged the muses themselves to a musical contest. He lost, and they punished him by taking away his sight and his musical ability. A devastating punishment for an artist. But what's relevant to our topic is that according to ancient sources, particularly Apollodorus, Thamyris was the first man to love males. Obviously, this can't be literally true. The timeline of Greek mythology doesn't work that way. And besides, we've already discussed relationships that supposedly happened earlier. But the Greeks credited Thamyris with being the first mortal man to openly love other males, or perhaps the first to prefer males exclusively. This attribution shows that the Greeks were aware of same-sex attraction as a phenomenon that had origins, whether mythological or historical. They thought about it, created stories to explain it, and attributed its introduction to specific figures. Thamyris was one such figure, along with Orpheus and others. The story also connects male love with artistic and musical excellence. Thamyris was skilled enough to challenge the muses. Orpheus's music could charm all living things. Apollo, the god most associated with male lovers, was god of music and poetry. There's a cultural association here between artistic sensibility, aesthetic appreciation, and attraction to male beauty. This association persisted through Greek culture. Poets wrote love poetry to males. Philosophers discussed male beauty in aesthetic terms. The symposium, the drinking party where educated men discussed philosophy and poetry, was also the social space where male-male romantic and sexual relationships were negotiated. Culture, art, and same-sex attraction were intertwined in Greek thought. Beyond the famous names, virtually every Greek city-state had local heroes whose mythology included same-sex relationships. These survive as fragments or mentions in travel writers' accounts. Pausanias, who wrote a detailed travel guide to Greece in the 2nd century AD, mentions numerous local shrines to heroes and the stories associated with them. Many involve male lovers, couples honoured together, tombs visited by male pairs seeking blessing, festivals commemorating tragic love stories between men. The Boeotian hero Cleomachus supposedly died fighting bravely to impress his male beloved, and this story was told to encourage military valour. The Chalcidians honoured male couples in their religious festivals. Various cities had gymnasia and wrestling schools where relationships between men and youths were formalised and regulated. These weren't scandalous secrets. These were recognised parts of civic life, with mythology providing the divine and heroic precedents for human behaviour. When a city wanted to encourage military courage, they told stories about heroes who fought to protect their lovers. When aristocratic men wanted to form alliances, they sometimes formalised them through relationships with each other's sons, with mythological precedents justifying the practice. The sheer pervasiveness of these stories across different regions, different time periods, and different sources indicates how normal this was in Greek culture. It wasn't one or two famous myths that happened to include same-sex relationships. It was a consistent pattern throughout Greek mythology, philosophy, religious practice, and social customs. To understand why Greek mythology is so full of same-sex love stories, we need to understand Greek cultural attitudes. The Greeks didn't think about sexuality in terms of heterosexual and homosexual. Those categories were invented in the 19th century. Instead, they thought about sexuality in terms of roles, ages, citizens versus non-citizens, penetrative versus receptive, active versus passive. The idealized relationship was between an older man, Erastes the lover, and a younger man or youth, Eromenos the beloved. The older man was expected to be the pursuer, to court the youth with gifts and attention, to serve as mentor and protector. The younger man was expected to be selective, to grant favors only to worthy suitors, and to benefit from the relationship through education and social advancement. This wasn't considered incompatible with eventual marriage to women. Most men would be Eromenos in their youth and Erastes as they matured, then marry and have children while potentially continuing relationships with younger males. Women lived in separate social spheres, and marriage was primarily for producing legitimate children and forming family alliances, not for romantic fulfillment. Plato's Symposium gives us the most detailed philosophical discussion of these relationships. The dialogue presents multiple perspectives on love, including love between men, suggesting it could be either purely physical or could inspire both partners toward philosophical excellence and virtue. The highest form of love, in Plato's vision, transcended physical attraction to become appreciation of beauty, wisdom, and truth itself. This philosophical framework meant that male-male relationships could be portrayed as either base and physical or elevated and spiritual, depending on how the participants approached them. The mythology reflected this range. Some stories are clearly about physical desire, others about profound spiritual connection, most about something in between. The mythology also provided divine validation for human practices. If Zeus loved Ganymede, if Apollo mourned Hyacinthus, if Achilles and Patroclus were the greatest heroes, then male-male love was divinely sanctioned, heroically exemplified, and culturally legitimate. The myths did important cultural work in establishing and maintaining social norms. When Rome absorbed Greek culture, they initially absorbed these myths more or less intact. Roman poets like Ovid, Virgil, and others retold Greek myths including the same-sex relationships, sometimes with changes to names or details, but maintaining the romantic content. Roman culture had somewhat different attitudes toward male sexuality, but Greek mythology remained foundational to Roman education and literature. As Christianity became dominant in the Roman Empire, attitudes shifted dramatically. Christian theologians condemned same-sex relationships explicitly, and increasingly the myths were either ignored, reinterpreted, or condemned as examples of pagan immorality. Medieval Christian scholars who preserved classical texts sometimes edited or commented on these stories to condemn them rather than celebrate them. Renaissance humanists rediscovering classical texts faced a dilemma. These were the foundational texts of Western civilization, taught to every educated person, but they contained content that Christian morality condemned. The solution was often careful translation choices, selective emphasis, and creative interpretation. Relationships became friendships. Explicit poetry became vague allegory. Clear statements about love between men became ambiguous. By the Victorian era, classical education was widespread but thoroughly sanitized. Students learned Greek and Latin, read Homer and Virgil, but somehow never quite noticed all the same-sex relationships, or were taught to interpret them as something other than what they obviously were. This wasn't ancient Greek culture. This was ancient Greek culture filtered through centuries of Christian reinterpretation and Victorian discomfort. Modern classical scholarship has increasingly recognized and corrected this distortion. Academic study of ancient sexuality has become more honest and nuanced. But popular retellings, children's mythology books, film adaptations, general audience histories often lag behind academic understanding. Many people still learn a sanitized version of Greek mythology that would be unrecognizable to ancient Greeks. These stories, all of them, from the famous to the obscure, tell us something important about human diversity across time. Same-sex love isn't a modern invention or a recent social development. It's been part of human experience for as long as we have records. The ancient Greeks not only acknowledged this, but celebrated it in their most important cultural texts. When we erase these stories or reinterpret them to be more comfortable for modern audiences, we're not protecting anyone. We're distorting history. We're making the past seem more homogeneous than it was. We're suggesting that acceptance of sexual diversity is somehow unnatural or unprecedented, when in fact, one of the most influential civilizations in human history integrated it into their culture, mythology, and religious practice. The Greek myths, as actually written, tell us that love between men could be divine, heroic, tragic, beautiful, and culturally celebrated. That's not a political statement or modern reinterpretation. That's just reading the sources as written. And as our long journey through Greek mythology draws to a close, it's worth reflecting on what we've discovered. Not a few isolated stories or ambiguous friendships, but a comprehensive tapestry of same-sex love woven throughout every level of Greek mythology, from the king of gods to mortal heroes, from cosmic creation to local traditions, celebrated in epic poetry, honored in religious ritual, taught to students, and held up as examples of virtue and devotion. Let's bring this journey home. Chapter 7. The Legacy. As we reach the end of our journey, it's worth taking a moment to reflect on what we've discovered over these past 2 hours. We began on Mount Olympus with Zeus, king of gods, who loved the shepherd prince Ganymede so deeply that he made him immortal and placed him among the stars. We walked through sun-drenched Greek meadows with Apollo, golden god of beauty, whose tragic love for hyacinthus created flowers that bloom every spring as eternal remembrance. We descended to the ocean depths with Poseidon, whose passion for Pelops shaped one of the most important dynasties in Greek mythology and gave an entire peninsula its name. We met Dionysus, the god who shattered every boundary the Greeks tried to establish, whose love for the satyr Ampelos became wine itself, the substance that brings joy and liberation to humanity. We stood on the battlefields of Troy, where Achilles' grief for Patroclus changed the course of the war and gave us one of literature's most profound explorations of love and loss. We walked beside Heracles through his impossible labours, supported by Iolaus, whose tomb became a shrine where male lovers sought blessing for centuries. And we explored dozens of other stories, some famous, some obscure, all of them part of the rich tapestry of Greek mythology that modern retellings so often edit into something more palatable, more comfortable, more aligned with expectations that the ancient Greeks themselves never had. What becomes clear when you read these myths as the Greeks actually wrote them is that same-sex love wasn't exceptional or transgressive in their mythology. It was simply part of the landscape of human and divine experience. Zeus loved women and men. Apollo loved women and men. Heroes had wives and male lovers. The gods fell in love with mortals regardless of gender, and mortals fell in love with each other in all possible combinations. The Greeks didn't see this as contradictory or confusing. They didn't need to categorize people as one thing or another. They recognized that attraction, love, and desire were more complex and varied than simple binary categories could capture. Their mythology reflected this understanding, giving them stories that explored every variation of love, loss, devotion, and desire. These weren't minor details or footnotes in Greek culture. The story of Zeus and Ganymede was painted on their finest pottery, placed in wealthy homes, given as valuable gifts. The relationship between Achilles and Patroclus was central to the Iliad, the foundational epic of Greek literature that every educated person knew by heart. The festival of Hyacinthia in Sparta was one of that city's most important religious celebrations, continuing for centuries. Male couples in Thebes visited Iolaus's tomb to sanctify their relationships with heroic blessing. This was mainstream culture, not underground knowledge. These stories were taught to children, discussed by philosophers, celebrated in religious ritual, referenced in political speeches, painted by artists, and performed in theatres. For over 1,000 years of Greek civilization, from the composition of Homer's epics through the Roman adoption of Greek culture and into the Byzantine preservation of classical texts, these stories remained part of the cultural inheritance. So what happened? How did we get from ancient Greeks celebrating these relationships to modern retellings that pretend they don't exist or were just very close friendships? The answer is complicated, involving the rise of Christianity with its very different sexual ethics, medieval reinterpretation of classical texts through Christian moral frameworks, Renaissance humanism trying to reconcile pagan classics with Christian morality, Victorian prudishness that couldn't even acknowledge heterosexual desire, let alone same-sex relationships, and 20th century mass education that wanted to teach classical mythology without confronting uncomfortable content. Layer by layer, translation by translation, retelling by retelling, these relationships were softened, obscured, reinterpreted, or simply deleted. Lovers became friends. Explicit poetry became vague allegory. Cultural practices that were clearly romantic became ambiguous mentorship. And eventually we arrived at a version of Greek mythology that the ancient Greeks themselves wouldn't recognize, one where these relationships are invisible or deniable. But here's the thing, the original sources still exist. The Iliad hasn't changed. Plato's Symposium still discusses these relationships explicitly. Ovid's Metamorphoses still tells the story of Apollo and Hyacinthus with full romantic detail. Pindar's Odes still describe Poseidon's love for Pelops. The vast paintings are still in museums. The archaeological evidence of hero shrines and religious practices still exists. Anyone willing to read these sources as written, without filtering them through centuries of reinterpretation and discomfort, can see clearly what the ancient Greeks actually believed and celebrated. The knowledge was never lost. It was just obscured, edited, and made uncomfortable enough that most people didn't look too closely. But tonight, we've looked. We've spent 2 hours exploring these stories as the Greeks told them, and what we've found is a mythology far richer and more honest about human experience than the sanitized versions many of us learned. We found gods who loved across gender boundaries, heroes whose deepest bonds were with male companions, tragedies that honored same-sex devotion as equally worthy of grief and remembrance as any heterosexual romance. These stories matter because they tell us something true about human diversity across time. They remind us that the acceptance of different forms of love isn't some modern invention or recent social experiment. One of the most influential civilizations in human history, the culture that gave us democracy, philosophy, theatre, epic poetry, and so much of the foundation of Western thought, integrated same-sex love into every level of their culture, and saw nothing unusual about it. When young people today struggle with their identity, when societies debate the legitimacy of different forms of love, when people wonder if acceptance is natural or possible, these ancient stories provide perspective. The Greeks figured this out 3,000 years ago. They created a mythology that honored all forms of love, celebrated diverse expressions of attraction and devotion, and held up both heterosexual and same-sex couples as examples of heroic virtue. We don't need to idealize ancient Greece. They had slavery, they subordinated women, they went to war constantly. Their acceptance of same-sex relationships often involved problematic age and power dynamics. They weren't perfect, but on this particular issue, they managed something that much of later Western civilization forgot. They recognized that love comes in many forms, all equally capable of inspiring devotion, sacrifice, heroism, and beauty. As our journey through the secret love lives of the Greek gods concludes tonight, we're reminded that the past is far from dusty and dull. It's a vibrant, often surprising, and always intriguing tapestry woven with human experience in all its complexity. The ancient Greeks, whatever their flaws, gave us stories that acknowledged that complexity rather than denying it. These myths survived for 3 millennia, not because later generations always understood or approved of them, but because they're fundamentally good stories, compelling narratives about love and loss, devotion and tragedy, the joys and sorrows that come with caring deeply about another person. The gender of the people involved doesn't change the emotional truth of these stories. A god grieving his beloved, a hero sacrificing everything for his companion, lovers separated by death. These are universal human experiences that transcend any particular configuration of genders. So, as you drift towards sleep tonight, remember that the myths we've explored are still here, still available to anyone willing to read them honestly. The ancient voices still speak, if we're willing to listen without filtering them through our own discomfort or expectations. As our journey through Greek mythology's same-sex love stories concludes tonight, we're reminded that the past is far from dusty and dull. It's a vibrant, often surprising, and always intriguing tapestry, woven with human ingenuity, resilience, and the occasional ancient love story that still makes us wonder. Until our next archaeological adventure together, this is the Sleeping Archaeologist, encouraging you to remain curious about the incredible tales still waiting to be discovered beneath our feet. Sweet dreams, fellow explorers. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and may your rest be filled with wonder at the remarkable tapestry of human history.